Okay, hi, my name is Wyatt Cross. I'm the director of the Montana Water Center based here at Montana State University. My co-author is Whitney Lonsdale, the assistant director. Now, a big part of our mission at the Water Center is to serve as sort of the nexus or the connector among different water entities across the state and to try to leverage all the existing expertise to synthesize information about topics that are crucial for the future of water in Montana. So our current project and today's webinar are focused on the topic of irrigation efficiency and water conservation. And specifically, we want to ask, how do changes in irrigation practice, and that is shifting from flood to sprinkler irrigation or the lining of irrigation canals, how do these things influence the hydrology of irrigated watersheds in Montana? Specifically, we want to know how these changes affect groundwater recharge and stream flow, and what might this mean for irrigators and other water stakeholders across the state. Now, second, we also want to explore, what strategies or opportunities exist to mitigate any unintended consequences of changing irrigation efficiency. In addition to how can irrigation management help optimize water supply for agriculture and other important but sometimes competing uses. And we think this is particularly important as we continue to see changes in climate and an increased general propensity for drought conditions. So starting in March of last year, we convened a technical working group consisting of folks that are represented here, as well as other practitioners, legislators, and citizens, and so on, to learn more about this topic. And we have this goal of basically providing information back to stakeholders, back to decision makers across the state. And so we're currently working on a written summary of what we've learned, but we want to first, of course, hear from you. Now, the topic of changes in irrigation efficiency and how they affect water supply is not new. This is certainly something that's been under discussion for quite a long time. Hydrologists and hydrogeologists from the DNRC and NBMG have been looking into this issue for many years, and it provided information in formal studies, public talks, reports to the legislature, etc., for a long time. If we go all the way back to 1978, the Water Conservation and Salvage Report was actually focused on understanding how changes in irrigation efficiency might influence water budgets across Montana. So this is not a new topic by any stretch of the imagination. But it is certainly true that there is a heightened or renewed interest in this topic, not just in Montana, but internationally. And I think that's because changes in climate and the various uncertainties that brings for our water supply. And so it's probably more important than ever that we carry this conversation forward, and especially for us to hear from you, from irrigators and irrigation managers on the ground, in terms of what kinds of real world things you are actually seeing in your daily practice. Now, what we've found through this process so far is that it is a hugely complex topic, and that's because all these perspectives that interact with irrigation practice are important. Okay, they're all important pieces of the puzzle, and they all interact. And so if we really want to understand how changes in irrigation efficiency are going to influence our water supply, our agriculture, our communities, it's really going to require a broader, multidisciplinary understanding of these various topics. Now, with this particular webinar, what we're hoping to do is reach out and hear from irrigators and irrigation managers across the state to kind of help us ground truth this information. And perhaps more importantly, we want to better understand the feasibility of the adaptation strategies that we're going to talk about towards the end of the webinar. So again, thanks so much for being here and your attention, and we're really looking forward to your feedback. Now, let's start with just a little bit of background that, of course, will be familiar to all of you. But irrigation and irrigated agriculture has been a huge part of Montana's history, its identity, and its economy since the mid-19th century. And it still is thriving today, supporting the production of a variety of crops that provide a critically important component of our food supply. Now, in addition, irrigated agriculture represents the largest consumptive use of water in the state. Okay, that's a big deal. This is water that's removed from the system largely through plant transpiration. So as a result, how irrigation water is managed will of course play a huge role in affecting water supply and availability across the state. And so if we're really looking to creative ways to balance our increasing demand for water with an increasingly uncertain supply, then irrigation management is really poised to play a central role. Now, another important part of the broader context, of course, is that irrigation has already greatly transformed Montana's landscape and hydrology. Okay? This is a slide from NBMG showing the vast canal network in western Montana. And here we are zoomed in on the right to the Gallatin Valley. And what you can see is that surface water for irrigation is now distributed to farms in these spider web-like patterns across our valleys. So surface water moves across the landscape in a way that is really quite different than pre-settlement times over 150 years ago. Now, much of the water that's spread out across this landscape isn't consumed by plants, but it seeps into groundwater in these vast kind of alluvial floodplains. So here we're looking at a map and an image of the Bitterroot Valley showing a variety of wetlands that are circled here that have been cataloged by the National Water Information System. These are actually new wetlands that have been created by seepage from irrigation, from fields, from canals, and so on. Now, in addition, over time, there's of course been significant development of homes in these alluvial floodplains. And so incidental recharge from irrigation is now supporting an increasing amount of domestic water use in our river valleys, like you can see here in the Bitterroot. In addition, these vast floodplain sponges that soak up irrigation water slowly leak that water back into surface waters, providing something that we call return flows. And these return flows often support a significant proportion of stream flow later in the year, so late summer, fall, and winter. And these are really important. And the return flows that come back from irrigation can be critical for downstream irrigators and livestock. They can be critical for various recreational opportunities and fishing, and of course for native species of concern like this West Slope cutthroat trout. So it's a brave new irrigated world, right? Over the past 150 years or so, irrigation has fully transformed the hydrology in many of our river valleys, and this is the new normal. And we're used to this new normal, and we've come to depend on this new normal. But there are changes that are taking place all across the West. So this is a figure that shows changes in irrigation practice over time in 17 different Western states, or combined 17 states. And you can see that while total water use for irrigation has remained relatively stable, that's shown up here in the blue line on top over time, there's been a steady decline in gravity and flood irrigation. This is the orange line kind of going down to the right, and an increase in pressure irrigation and sprinkler irrigation. That's the brown line going up to the right. We see the same general pattern in Montana. And here are some of the data. It's been recently estimated that between 1971 and 2019, about 21% of flood irrigation was converted to sprinkler irrigation, with most of that going into center pivot irrigation. You can see in the graphic here on the right how that's been distributed across the major river basins in Montana. Now, of course, there are really good reasons for this change, for making these changes to more efficient irrigation types, right? Shifting to sprinkler irrigation, of course, reduces the amount of labor necessary and importantly, the cost of labor. Shifting to sprinklers can lead to increased crop production because water can be distributed more evenly. And shifting to sprinklers can lead to increased irrigation efficiency, which basically just means that more of the water diverted from the source actually goes straight into producing crops. And finally, there have been a number of financial incentive programs over the years that have benefited and helped people make this shift. But as we learn more about irrigation systems and about hydrology, we still have this lingering question about changing irrigation efficiency. Does the shift from flood to sprinkler irrigation or the lining of irrigation canals actually conserve water? This is a question that's not always easy to answer, and that's because it really requires a solid understanding of what's going on hydrologically. Okay, so really trying to understand irrigation hydrologic budgets. This kind of understanding really only comes with years and years of experience and local knowledge on the ground, right? or from detailed and quantitative irrigation water budgets. And unfortunately, this is something we certainly don't have for some of our watersheds across Montana. But there are some general patterns that have emerged from various studies and a lot of local knowledge across the West and in Montana that can tell us something about how changes in irrigation efficiency are influencing hydrology. Okay, so first of all, typically with a shift to sprinkler irrigation, we see that the amount of water diverted during times of active irrigation is actually reduced. And this is because sprinkler irrigation can apply water to fields more efficiently, and therefore less diversion is actually required. This typically leaves more water in the streams and rivers during the time of active irrigation when irrigators are using sprinklers instead of flood irrigation. Now, because this unused water moves downstream, this can have consequences for when and where water is available throughout the watershed during the irrigation season. And that's a really important point. The second common hydrologic response to a shift from flood to sprinkler irrigation is that the amount of diverted water transpired or consumed by crops tends to increase. Again, this is because diverted water can be distributed more evenly and precisely in space and time. Crops might even grow more densely and robustly. And in some cases, this shift might enable a change in the type of crop that the farmer is irrigating. Okay, so some of the time, a shift to sprinkler irrigation means that consumption by crops may actually increase. Okay, finally, another important change is that with a switch from flood to sprinkler irrigation, you tend to see a reduction in seepage from canals, ditches, and farm fields, and so on, to groundwater. And this is because less of the water is being spread out along the canal system or onto fields to seep into the groundwater. And of course, this can lead to declines in aquifer recharge, and in some cases, the reduced return flows that could support downstream irrigators or surface water flows for other uses. Okay? And so taken together, these generalized changes that come from changes in irrigation practice can lead to a couple things. And the first is one that folks are calling the irrigation efficiency paradox. And this is basically the idea that an increase in irrigation efficiency that comes with new technologies does not necessarily lead to increased water savings, especially at the watershed scale. And of course, this will depend on the balance of these various hydrologic changes and the local conditions, and that's a really important point as well. Second, changes in irrigation efficiency can change the timing and availability of water supply, perhaps freeing up water in the spring, but maybe having the unintended consequences of reducing late season water availability for downstream water users. Again, the specifics of these impacts and how they play out will vary significantly from place to place, and that's why we want to, again, hear from you and what you've seen in your particular watershed. Now, another really important point to make here is that the spatial scale that one considers when thinking about irrigation efficiency matters a lot. So for instance, in a group of farms like those shown here on this graph, high up in the watershed, a group of farms that use flood irrigation, we might expect that about 50% of the water that's diverted to these farms is actually consumed and used up. And we consider these farms, or this group of farms, to be 50% efficient. But the water that isn't consumed by these farms isn't necessarily lost from the system, right? So the unused water might seep into groundwater or back into ditches and be used again on other farms further down gradient or even later during that same irrigation season. And so if we consider a much larger spatial scale, so here we're looking at most of the watershed, what we'll likely see is that a greater proportion of the diverted water is actually consumed by crops because of this recycling of seepage within the watershed. In some of the most extreme cases, all of the diverted water may eventually be consumed at the watershed scale. And you can imagine, in this context, changes to more efficient sprinkler irrigation across the watershed or at any of these scales will lead to reduced seepage, which might jeopardize water availability for downstream water users. And so spatial scale is something we really need to consider a lot when we think about this particular topic. Okay, just a couple key points before we get wrapped up here. First, irrigation has fundamentally changed the hydrology in many of our watersheds, and that's very apparent. Second, ongoing changes in irrigation practice and the shift to sprinkler irrigation or the lining of canals have the potential to influence water supply and the timing of when water is available through reduced diversions, through increases in crop consumption, and through reductions in aquifer recharge. Finally, and this is maybe the most important part, all sites are different. Okay, it's really, really tough to generalize these things at every single watershed, and this is exactly why we want to hear from you. What have you seen in your watershed over the past number of decades, or just in the recent past? We want to know if these are consistent with what you're seeing in your daily practice. Okay, and so in closing, this really leads us to a few of our most important water challenges for the state. Okay? Given the likelihood of increasing water scarcity, can we identify water management strategies that optimize water supply for irrigated agriculture? Okay, that's really, really important moving forward. Second, can irrigation management be a tool that helps us build a sustainable water supply for both agriculture and other important water needs into the future? This is not going to be an easy task, but it's certainly why we need to work on adaptation strategies that aim for win-win solutions within the context of the prior appropriation doctrine. Okay, so I want to thank you so much for listening and for your time, and I want to invite you to please, when you can, watch the second brief section that we'll post focused on adaptation strategies and opportunities. And after you've watched both of these short webinar sections, we'd love to follow up with a phone call to get your feedback and your perspective and hear about what actually happens on the ground. So thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope to talk to you soon. All right, take care.